The year was 1957, and the sound that changed everything wasn't a roar or an explosion. It was a beep, a faint mechanical pulse transmitted from orbit, circling Earth every 96 minutes, and suddenly the entire world stopped to listen. Sputnik wasn't just a satellite. It was a statement, a challenge, a crack in the foundation of how millions of people understood power, progress, and possibility itself. For the Soviet Union, this wasn't about science alone. It was about rewriting the story of who they were in the eyes of history. A nation emerging from the ashes of war, battered by loss, now reaching beyond the atmosphere to prove that the future didn't belong to one empire. It belonged to whoever dared to dream louder. And in that moment, they did. The cultural shockwave that followed wasn't limited to Moscow or Washington. It rippled into classrooms, living rooms, art studios, and the hearts of children who suddenly believed the impossible might be within reach. But what we often forget is how deeply that race into space was intertwined with identity. For Soviet citizens, space wasn't just a frontier. It was proof of resilience. It was validation. After decades of propaganda depicting the West as technologically superior, untouchable, suddenly their engineers had done what no one else could. Yuri Gagarin's smile became a symbol not just of human achievement, but of collective pride. His flight in 1961 wasn't experienced as a distant government triumph. It was personal. Factories stopped. Streets filled. Strangers embraced. It was as if the entire nation had been lifted into orbit alongside him. And in the West, the reaction was equally visceral. Panic, doubt, a scramble to catch up. American schools restructured curriculums overnight. Mathematics and science were no longer optional luxuries. They became matters of survival. The space race didn't just fuel technological innovation. It reshaped education systems, inspired a generation of engineers, and embedded the stars into the cultural consciousness of an entire era. Films, music, literature, all of it began orbiting this singular obsession with the cosmos. The Cold War had gone vertical, but beneath the propaganda and the politics, something deeper was happening. The space race was forcing humanity to confront its own smallness. The images sent back from orbit, those early grainy photographs of Earth hanging in the void, began to dissolve borders in the mind. It didn't matter if you were American or Soviet. From space, the distinctions vanished. The planet was singular, fragile, and for a brief moment, that realization threatened to overshadow the rivalry itself. Cosmonauts and astronauts, trained to be warriors of ideology, instead became witnesses to unity they weren't supposed to see. Inside the Soviet Union, space became woven into the fabric of everyday life. Children's books featured rockets and cosmonauts as heroes, not soldiers. Murals on apartment blocks depicted stars and orbits. Even fashion reflected it. The aesthetic of futurism, sleek lines, metallic tones, optimism wrapped in aluminum, became the visual language of progress. Space wasn't a distant military project, it was a cultural movement, a collective identity anchored in the belief that tomorrow could be radically different from today. Yet the cost was immense. Behind the triumphant propaganda reels were engineers working under crushing pressure, cosmonauts taking unimaginable risks, and a government willing to sacrifice almost anything to maintain the narrative of superiority. Failures were hidden, tragedies erased from public memory. The space race wasn't just about reaching the stars. It was about controlling the story of who got there first and what it meant. And in that sense, it was as much a war of narratives as it was a technological arms race. The cultural impact extended far beyond the Soviet Union's borders. Developing nations watched with fascination. If a country ravaged by war could reach space within a generation, what did that say about their own potential? The space race became a symbol of possibility for the global South, a narrative that progress wasn't reserved for the wealthy West. It was attainable. It was proof that history could be rewritten, that nations could leapfrog centuries of development through vision and will. The Soviet model, flawed as it was, offered an alternative story of modernity. And then, slowly, the race began to wind down. The moon landings détente cooperation on projects like Apollo. The adversaries who had been locked in existential competition began shaking hands in orbit. The cultural significance of that shift was profound. Space, once a battlefield, was becoming neutral ground, a place where collaboration might actually be possible. The legacy of the Soviet space program wasn't just technological, it was philosophical. It asked the question, what happens when we stop competing and start exploring together? What surprised me the most wasn't just how a beautifully curated Cold War documentary collection improved my experience with understanding this era, but how everything started to feel different once I switched to the right one. I didn't expect such a clear change, and honestly, I tested more than a few before finding what actually worked. This isn't a promo or sponsorship, just sharing real results that made a noticeable difference for me. I'll leave the link below, in case you want to dig into it yourself and see what I mean. The space race shaped more than politics or technology. It shaped how generations understood ambition, risk, and human potential. It taught us that the pursuit of something larger than ourselves could unify or divide, inspire or terrify. The Soviet contribution to that story is undeniable. They were the first to orbit, the first to send a human beyond our atmosphere, the first to touch the far side of the moon. And in doing so, they reminded the world that progress isn't owned by any one nation, it's earned by those brave enough to reach. Tell us which country or city you're watching from. See you in the next video. Bye.